This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Isobel Harper wakes to the dream. The images come back in her waking hours like still frames of cinema noir. The camera shots collapsing and superimposing upon each other. A girl's silent scream caught in the glare of a streetlight. A man's fist poised at a door. Street signs streaking past a car window. The toothless smile of a jack-o'-lantern. Bare feet blurring across wet grass. Two hands locked in a death grip. Each time the dream shots tumble out in no particular order. But the final image is always the same. Two hands suspended in time over a kitchen table. Isobel knows that the girl is her child self, Izzy. But the dream doesn't tell the whole story. And it never will. October 1956. Izzy watches the neon signs float past her mother's car window. Her dad never came home for dinner, and they're searching the parking lots. She hates it when he stays out late, and they have to bring him home. He's always in a tavern when they find him, and Izzy doesn't like it there. The rooms smell like old cigars and spilled beer, and it's dark in there with loud music playing. Tonight, she and her mom are making the rounds past his haunts. There's Frank's cigar store, which has a bar and serves sandwiches, and Eddie's tap room with its pink fluorescent sign. There's Freddie's Pour House, and there's another place whose name she can't remember, with a bowling alley in the back. When they find his car, Mom always sends her in. He won't come out for anybody else, and even she has to wait for him. Your dad'll come out if you go in, Mom says. And that's true. Every time she walks in there, he hikes her up onto the bar stool, yelling, "Hey, Frank, look who's here to see me." Like it's nothing to see a little girl walk into a bar in the middle of the night. Then he buys her an orange soda while he finishes his beer. Poor Mom has to wait outside in the car until he gets good and ready to drop Izzy in the front seat. And that's on the good nights. Tonight, Mom isn't in the mood to fetch him. "Let him rot in there," she says, as they spot his car in Frank's parking lot. "We know where he is, and he'll come home when he's ready. Let's go get a pumpkin." It's almost Halloween, and Izzy's been bugging her for one. They drive past Frank's and down St. Paul's Street to Wolanski's Market. "Hi, Lenore." "Hi, Izzy," Mrs. W. calls when they walk into the store. Izzy likes Wolanski's. She usually hits Mom up for a comic when they go grocery shopping on Saturdays. They walk down the aisle to the produce section, surveying the pumpkins. There's one with a perfect round head and a flat back that makes it look brain damaged. Another has a nice tall shape, but an uneven bottom that makes it list sideways. A squatty, bulging pumpkin could be interesting, but the side of it's crushed and pockmarked with pumpkin acne. "There's a good one." Izzy points to the back of the bin. They have to call Mr. Wolanski over to heft it out. It's perfect. Not too oblong or too squatty, and no bad spots. All the way home, Mom's biting the side of a fingernail, looking at her watch. It's almost 9 o'clock when they pull in. No sign of his car in the driveway. Maybe they should go over there and get him before he gets too drunk and starts yelling things. Mom's never been too handy with a knife, and she might wreck a perfectly good pumpkin, not to mention the yelling. Izzy's lugging the heavy thing up the walkway and running the jack-o'-lantern possibilities over in her head. Maybe a hobo pumpkin with burned cork on its orange cheeks, or a clown pumpkin with a goofy smile and sad eyes. Mom's always been in charge of the Halloween costumes, but Dad's the master carver and a source of endless pumpkin personalities. One year it was a pirate pumpkin with a single tooth in its crooked mouth. They'd put one of Dad's work bandanas around the stem and a black patch over one eye. Another year it was a Popeye pumpkin with a sailor hat dangling off the stem and an old corncob pipe in the glowering slit of its mouth. They laid a can of spinach on the stoop so all the trick-or-treaters would know who he was. She's counting the minutes and still no sign of Dad. Her stomach tightens, and she prays he'll come home sober before Mom starts whacking at the pumpkin. Mom hates knives. Izzy's been pestering her for a Bowie knife ever since she saw Davy Crockett at the movies. She got a coonskin cap for her birthday, which she wears all the time. But so far, no Bowie knife. Every time she mentions it, Mom hollers, "You'll cut your hand off with one of those things." She's pretty sure Dad'll buy her one. He winks at her every time Mom starts screaming about it. She pictures Davy Crockett's men stabbing the soldiers with swords and knives, knocking them off the Alamo roof like rats. She loves the movies, and the westerns are her favorite. She's seen Shane twice at the matinees. She loves the part where Shane walks into that bar, calls the gunslinger in the black vest a low-down Yankee liar, then shoots up the whole place and everybody in it, except for Joey and his dog. She still cries at the ending, poor Joey yelling, "Shane, Shane, come back." Mom's pulling the butcher knife out of the drawer now. It's bigger than the Bowie knife in the movies. Mom's been sighing at the clock ever since they got home, and now she's looking jittery with that knife in her hand. So how do you start with this thing? She holds it like a dead fish, clearly clueless about knives. "You want me to do it?" "Absolutely not. You'll..." "Cut my hand off." "I know." "So, you cut the top off first, right?" "Yeah, Dad makes a little circle around the stem first." "God help me. I'll probably cut my hand off with this thing." Mom's jagging crooked slits into the tough pumpkin skin with a dull butcher knife. When she pries off the top, an overripe, musky odor fills the room. They lay the pumpkin on some newspapers, yanking out the strings of slimy seeds, shaking the slime onto the newspaper, and wiping their noses with the backs of their wrists. "You gotta get all that wet crap out or the candle won't stay lit. Dad always uses a big spoon." Mom gets a soup spoon and begins to scrape big flaps of pumpkin and seeds out of the bottom and the sides. When the inside is smooth and level, they wrap the mess into the newspaper, throwing it into the garbage. "So, what should we make this year?" Mom wheels the knife like a magic wand. "I was thinking maybe we could make a hobo pumpkin?" Of the two jack-o'-lantern designs, this one's her favorite. What would that look like?" "Well, remember when you dressed me like a hobo for Halloween and put burnt cork on my face and made me that bandana on a stick?" "Oh, that's a good idea. So we'd put the stick and the bandana next to him in some way?" "Yeah, we could prop it up against the house or something." "Good idea. Look in the drawer over there and see if we have any cork from last Halloween." She shuffles through the drawer. "Don't see any." "Got it. Here it is." "Okay, bring it over. We'll burn it on the stove later." "What should he look like? Happy or sad?" Izzy steals a glance at the clock. The chances of his coming home sober ticking down by the second. Mom grabs a pencil out of the drawer. "Let's draw the mouth and eyes so we don't make a mistake." She's an artist, so Izzy trusts her with that part. The carving, she's not so sure about. By 9:45, Mom's drawn a pretty good hobo face with no intricate little bits to carve with that clumsy butcher knife. "Here goes nothing." Mom presses the knife into the corner of the pumpkin's mouth, the blade buckling against the thick hide. Izzy's thinking about hand amputation when the door opens, and she hears two loud stomps and a scudding on the tile floor. She peeks around the corner. Dad is falling into the door frame. He rights himself. "Hey, Lenore." His speech is dead slow, his eyes glazed and menacing. He lurches around the doorframe, holding on with both hands, then staggering past Izzy into the kitchen. He spots Mom with the knife, then jolts backward toward Izzy. "What's that, Iz? Did you go out and get a pumpkin without your dear old dad?" With every D of the sentence, spit flies out of his lips. "You don't know nothing about pumpkin carving, Lenore. Get out of my way." Izzy's stomach clenches as each syllable dribbles out of him. "Let me show you how it's done." He reels toward the butcher knife, but Mom grabs it out of his reach. "Willie, I'm not giving you this knife around Izzy." He snatches her wrist with one hand. "We'll see about that." He drags her back toward him, twisting the knife out of her hand, like he's opening a pop bottle. "Willie, put that knife down. I said I don't want it around Izzy." She's practically screaming now, but he's got it in his grip, waving it back and forth in her face like a windshield wiper, pounding out each word. "You don't know a goddamn thing about carving pumpkins, Lenore. Izzy, get out of this kitchen, now." Mom's voice is steely, her eyes dead level. Izzy's glued to her spot, eyes fixed on the knife in her father's hands. "God damn her, I'll show you how it's done. Right, pal?" He turns a dark eye back toward Izzy. She's still glued. He stabs the knife into the pumpkin's eye. The blade bends and springs out of his hand, clattering to the tabletop. Mom lurches toward it. He twists his head sideways, pinning her wrist to the table, knife and all. They're stretched across the table, both grasping at the handle. Mom's cutting him with her eyes, punching out every word in a slow, flat monotone. "Willie, I don't want you using knives around Izzy. Now why don't you just go to—" They both got hold of it now, slamming it from side to side like they're arm wrestling with a knife. Izzy stares at Dad's bulging biceps and the thin sleeve of her mother's sweater. She knows how these things end in the movies. There's always a winner and a loser. It's never good for the loser. And the winners are always big, strong men. The howl that streaks out of her pierces her own eardrums, almost to the shattering point. But her parents are locked in the grip of the struggle, and they don't look. She slams out the front door, bolting across the lawn and under the streetlight, her mind's eye fixed on the frozen image of the knife in their hands. She's seen the movies. In the very next frame, it will twist to one side or the other and come right down through the center of her life as she knows it. She's screaming animal sounds now, staring into the streetlight until the insides of her eyes glow red with the light's after-image. But the still frame of the hands is still there, superimposing itself over all the knives she's ever seen in the movies, now falling in a fractured sequence. A woman pinned to a wall, her silhouette framed by a knife thrower's blades. A sword swallower thrusting a blade down the gorge of his own throat. A cowboy gasping his last breath as a knife tears through his shirt. There are blades and blades tumbling through the abyss of her fear until the streetlight fades from view and the freeze frames fall back into black. And now there is nothing but a smooth, frozen darkness. It envelops her as she falls down and down through the blackness until there is only sound. Her scream has gone ragged, dragging down to darkness. It's her voice and not hers at all, soaring up from the center of a deep pinpoint of emptiness, piercing her ears with its ferocity and rage until it too recedes into the dark. She's so far from that voice that it's no longer hers. It's a movie scream, rising out of that still image that has returned from the darkness. 2 hands on a kitchen table, a knife gripped between them. And now, not even the voice that is and is not hers can be heard. Her lips are moving, but there is no sound. And no her. Fade to black. Her eyelids are frozen as she struggles to open them. Images and sounds are tumbling in and out of each other. Her father's face looming out from the grin of a jack-o'-lantern. Her own scream rising up from her mother's mouth. Dad's rant piercing through the loud music of a jukebox. Mom's stiff wrist bones rising beneath the blur of feet on dark grass. And the raucous drumbeat of fists, pounding and pounding and pounding in a deafening cadence on a door. This is what wakes her. And when her eyes fuzz into focus, the frozen image of the hands is gone. All she sees is the policeman at the door, and her mother standing just inside it, with her apron on. When Izzy grows into Isobel, there will be an ocean of blackness between the streetlight and the knock on her parents' door. Each time the dream comes back, she will try to remember how she got back inside, or whose hands carried her in, or held her when she got there. She will not recall where her father was when she woke to the sounds of a fist on the door and tried to speak, but had no voice. And for years to come, she will wonder which neighbor or friend or stranger in a passing car summoned the officer at the sound of her screams. For the rest of their lives, the three of them will never talk of this again. All that Isobel will remember, from that final moment when the still image fades to black, will be the fists on the door, and the man in the uniform, and her mother's last words as she stood in the doorway just before saying good night and closing the door. "Everything's fine, officer. My daughter was just having a nightmare."
That was Cinema Noir, written and read by Susan Hynds.
Susan, welcome to The Strange Recital.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I just love The Strange Recital.
Well, thank you.
It reminds me of sitting around a radio when we didn't have a TV and I was just a very little kid. And I'd listen to those old radio shows like The Shadow and Inner Sanctum with its squeaking door.
I'm glad it brings back those memories. One of the consequences of the pandemic is that authors don't always come to record at our studio these days. So you recorded yourself reading the story.
And you did a great job. Do you work in audio?
Well, thanks. I have to admit that I'm completely self-taught. All that I know I've learned from YouTube tutorials and making mistakes, which, of course, are always our greatest teachers.
Yes.
I actually learned to use video and sound editing software several years ago when I decided to become Ken Burns and make a documentary film with absolutely no budget. So I had to do all the video editing and the voiceovers myself. Editing film, I think, is a lot like writing. You're sort of laying down drafts in the form of clips and tracks and then editing them into a story,
Yeah.
much like a novelist does.
You're in Syracuse. We're in Woodstock. It's an upstate New York conversation. Should we imagine that your story is set in an upstate New York town?
I'm sure you could. Cinema Noir is actually a chapter from a novel that I'm writing called Dreams of Waking Up. The entire novel follows Izzy's family from 1945 when Willie gets off a troop train from the war, and it goes all the way up to 2020. It's actually set in northern Illinois, but it very well could be in upstate New York.
I thought it might.
You'd need a town that would be small, maybe 10,000 people, It would be a working class community with a large factory that employs most of the people in the town.
Mm-hmm.
And this is important. It would have 5 Catholic churches within a half block of each other. I'm sure you could find a place like that in upstate New York, probably.
Yeah.
I didn't realize this was from a novel. One thing I like is the photography angle that you incorporate into the story. It's perhaps as if the grown-up Isobel is a photographer. Tell us about why you chose that approach.
Well, I think you'll have to read the novel to find out what Izzy's going to become when she turns into Isobel. But, I actually didn't think of photography or film as a guiding image for this story until I wrote the opening dream sequence, and I kept seeing these black and white still shots, sort of, tumbling through space on a dark background. I guess you could say that, metaphorically, things were pretty black and white in 1956. You were either, feminine or masculine or a villain or a victim or whatever. Kids in those days didn't have video games or electronic media to entertain them. You went to the movies and you could go into the theater for 25 cents and stay there all day. They didn't kick you out in those days. So I think a lot of the ideas and norms and customs of these kids were shaped by the images that they saw in the movies. And a lot of those movies were, black and white.
Yeah.
Now, cinema noir suggests a film about a detective solving a murder mystery. It's a stereotype that you chose not to follow. Why that title?
I typically don't choose titles until after I've written something. I tend to read back what I've written and look for images or themes, or words that seem to capture the whole story. I think the title Cinema Noir floated up pretty quickly for me because the story I ended up with reminded me of one of those old black and white shows that I used to watch on TV, like Twilight Zone or Alfred Hitchcock. And you're right that there's no detective solving a murder mystery in this story, and I hadn't thought of this until you posed this question. But I'd say that for Izzy, the story of that night really is a murder mystery. I mean, something's going to happen.
Okay.
We don't know what. Is Dad going to come home drunk or not? Is somebody going to get murdered or injured with that knife? And she knows from the movies that knife is going to fall to one side or the other, and it's going to radically change her life as she knows it. So I think for her, it definitely is a murder mystery. Thanks for that question, because it really makes me see my own story in a new light.
Well, one of my thoughts on that subject, and feel free to tell me if I'm completely off base, is that the photo and movie device you use suggests a philosophy about life and memory and even reality that it's impossible for us to separate so-called reality from the narrative depictions of that reality that we're completely submerged in modern culture. Life is a story on a screen.
Wow, that's a great question. It's, a philosophical question, but it's also very related, I think, to the little girl in this story. What I was trying to capture in this piece was the sort of fragmented and episodic memory that children and later their adult selves experience as a result of trauma. And this kind of false memory syndrome, as it's called in the literature on childhood trauma, is sometimes experienced by the perpetrator as well, interestingly. The next chapter in this novel is actually from the point of view of Willie as he wakes up the next morning and only remembers fragments of the night before until they start flashing back at him throughout a day and actually terrify him about what he might have done that night. And so what we call alcoholic blackouts, probably have the same qualities as so-called false memories. What we call reality is always going to be filtered through our emotions, whether it's terror or suspense or whatever. So in any traumatic event, all we're left with really is the story we tell about it. I mean, there are no dead bodies that night. Izzy wakes up in the house somehow and her mom's alive standing there at the door. But that night will come back to Isobel in dreams, so that the story she tells herself actually does, I think, more psychic damage than the actual outcome of that night.
Yeah, the stories we tell ourselves.
Brent tends to go off into the stratosphere sometimes. Too much sitting and thinking. I was just going to say, I like the depiction of pumpkin carving. Something I do yearly with my daughter. But I do it sober.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, Tom.
Yeah.
I've been the dedicated carver for my daughter's jack-o'-lanterns on occasion, and I went out and bought myself one of those little X-Acto knives so I wouldn't cut my arm off with a butcher knife. You should definitely not drink and carve.
Well, I'll do my best in that regard. So, an important theme in the story is domestic violence and the complex issue of why marriages stay together in the face of alcoholism and abuse. At the end, it seems we may even have a case of battered wife syndrome. Can you say something about that?
Yes, I belong to a critique group that meets every Monday morning, and over the past year I've workshopped all 30 chapters of the novel with them. And the recurring question is always, why does Lenore stay with Willie? Battered wife syndrome, which Lenore is clearly trapped in, is very layered, though, and complicated.
Yeah.
First of all, you can tell by Izzy's comments that Willie is not a complete monster. I mean, he carves pumpkins for her. He's going to get her a Bowie knife. He'll come out of a bar for her and nobody else. In literature and in life, unless you're talking about melodrama, there are no pure villains or victims. And then there's the time frame. In the 50s, there were no women's shelters or daycare centers. If a woman filed for divorce and a man either refused or couldn't pay alimony, she had to go to work. And who was going to take care of her child? There's also the issue of self-esteem. The more battered a spouse becomes, the less likely that she or he, because there are battered husbands, the less likely they're going to have the agency to leave. And, finally, I think if the abuse is episodic, like someone might be a binge drinker, and Willie happens to be one of those binge drinkers, there are periods when he's penitent and begs for forgiveness and things return to normal. And I think that women can become addicted to those happy times and also to the notion that they can somehow reform or save their abuser in some way. There's so many reasons why women in the 50s stayed with these men and why, sadly, why so many people do today.
Back on the movie thing, I enjoyed being reminded of old favorite movies from my childhood, The Alamo, Shane, John Wayne, Alan Ladd, from back in the day when Westerns were my main fantasy. I like the fact that in your story, it's a girl who likes those movies, not what we expect from the times.
She did love the movies and the Westerns. Anything with guns and knives were definitely her favorites. She is not a little girl who's going to ever let her mother shop in the girls' department for her clothing. But in some ways, I don't think she was all that atypical. You have to realize this story takes place on the cusp of what would become the space race.
Mm-hmm.
The very next year, the Russians would put a rocket into space, and suddenly all kinds of girls wanted to be scientists. When she gets older, Izzy has bug collections and a chemistry set, and she dreams about being the first woman on the moon. So, while the 50s were definitely conformist in terms of gender equality and a lot of other social issues, they were also a time when a lot of girls her age began to set their sights on something other than being a wife or a mother. A lot of girls were tomboys then. Boys just had more fun. Who wants to clomp around in their mother's high heels when they could be out riding bikes or, playing cops and robbers?
Yeah.
So I think it's just a bit of a myth that girls were stereotypically feminine in those days.
So tell us about your other writing in addition to the novel, either past work or new projects.
Well, in my previous life as a professor of English education at Syracuse University, I did manage to write 7 nonfiction books.
Wow.
Most of them were directed toward teachers who wanted to help their high school and middle school kids learn to love writing and literature.
Okay.
But until 2 years ago, when I went to a writing retreat in the Catskills and met some remarkable teachers who would become my mentors, I'd really never dreamed of writing fiction. So Noir is actually my first published work of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I'm focused on revising Dreams of Waking Up and getting an agent or a publisher. But in the future, I just have this dream that Izzy's going to grow up and change her name to Belle and go to college during the Vietnam War era. So stay tuned.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you, Susan.
Yes, thanks for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Tom, what was that crack about too much sitting and thinking?
Well, it's true, isn't it?
Well, that's nobody's business but my own.
Sorry, we're on the internet. Privacy no longer exists. Didn't you know? This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was an excerpt from Dances and Dames by Kevin MacLeod, and also an excerpt from Noir No. 1 by Pedro. Both these tracks were promoted by Mr. Snooze. This is episode 21091.